ומתי שאתה מוכן, תתחיל.
בסדר גמור. It's you ready now?
כן. אתה רוצה לדבר איך אתה אוהב לדבר? למצלמה, אליי? מה הכי נוח לך?
מה שיותר אפקטיבי מבחינת הצופים.
המצלמה.
המצלמה.
המצלמה על זה, אם אפשר. כן, בדיוק.
אוקיי.
כן. טיפה להתקרב זה. כן. בול. מצוין, תודה רבה.
בסדר גמור.
טוב, אני מוכן מתי שאתה מוכן.
Fine, and I'm ready. I can go,
Yeah.
go ahead. That's fine. Do you hear?
כן.
Very good. Well, what I'm going to discuss within the next few minutes are basically some aspects of Judo-Persian culture, and particularly what we call Judo-Persian literature. The two things are closely linked. You cannot really understand and appreciate Judo-Persian writings and Judo-Persian literature without knowing a little bit about the history of Iranian Jews. Of course, you know, the origins of Jews in Iran, which is a huge country, go back to basically to the destruction of the first temple and the first exile, and after that, the destruction of the second temple and so on. So ever since, like we can say, between 700 BCE all the way through the destruction of the second temple, which was 70 of Common Era, Jews were exiled, or some of them chose to move to areas that were under Iranian influence. Iranian political influence, Iranian cultural influence, Iranian languages, and so on. The truth of the matter is, though, that our information about the usage of Persian language and creation of works in Persian go a few centuries later, and basically they start from the Islamic era. When we say Islamic era, we point to basically to the beginning of Islamic influence in Iran, which is in the 7th century. That's when Iran was conquered by the Arab armies, and the country became gradually, it took about 2-3 centuries until the country became almost completely Muslim, except for some religious minorities that were left, and Jews were, of course, among them. Now, when we want to discuss the different areas of literature among the Jews of Iran, again, our information really goes back to the early centuries of the Islamic period in Iran, which is again from 7th-8th century and onward. Now, there are two dates that are very important in order to understand what happened to the Jews in Iran, and things that affected very strongly the nature of Iranian Jews and their cultural activities and their literary activities within Iran. The first fact is that when Iran became Muslim, Iranian Jews preserved the languages that they spoke until then, which were dialects of, which were basically Iranian dialects. We have numerous Iranian dialects. The Iranian Jews spoke in those languages, and they preserved them within their communities. This is the first fact. The second factor that is very important is that gradually, Iranian Jews who within their communities spoke those local Iranian languages, which contained some Hebrew and Aramaic factors, gradually they adopted the larger Persian language, which contained lots of Arabic and Islamic influences. The first literary documents of Iranian Jews go back to the 8th, 9th century. Unfortunately, what happens, during the 12th century, Iran was conquered by the Mongols, and lots of Iranian communities and Iranian Jewish communities were destroyed. So a lot of the activity that was evidently done within those communities in Persian language either was destroyed or that we have very, very little information about it. Now, I say little, but that little is very important. Whatever we have, whatever documents and whatever writings we have that go back to the beginning of that go back to the period before the Mongol invasion. The Mongol invasion was beginning of the 12th century. Whatever we have there is mostly commentaries and interpretations and translations of the Bible and the books of the Bible into Persian. What happens after the Mongol invasion, it is as if suddenly we come into a poet that is considered to be the first Jewish Persian and the most famous and influential poet that Iranian Jews have created, and his name is Shahin. The name of the poet is evidently a pen name. It's a pseudonym that he adopted, or if you would like, it was a title that he chose, but we don't know what his real name was. The importance of Shahin within Judo-Persian literature, and again, when we speak about Judo-Persian literature, we're talking mostly about writings of Jews that were conducted in Persian, in Hebrew alphabet, varieties of Hebrew alphabet. Those writings that had to do with both sacred and secular poetry and writings continued all the way until the beginning of the first 2-3 decades of the 20th century. So we are talking about a period of almost roughly about 700 years in which Jews in various communities in Iran created works of literature. Many of these works are works in the area of poetry, and they were strongly influenced by the literary activity of the Muslims in Iran. So if I said that the first and most prominent Judo-Persian poet was Shahin in the 14th century, we see that actually Shahin in many ways was the founder of a tradition that continued more or less about 700 years. What were the works of Shahin? I will try to make it very, very short and to point to his major works. As I said, the first remnants or literary remnants of Iranian Jews or the most important writings of Persian Jews, which we call them Judeo-Persian writings or Judeo-Persian literature, they were related in one way or another to the Bible and to the books of the Bible. What Shahin did, and it is quite puzzling because when we look at his work, it seems that he followed other poets that were before him. That it cannot be that a tradition or a work that is so expansive and so large and in many ways so rich was all of a sudden came into being without having any antecedents and any prior background. But we don't know what that background was. Therefore, we assume that Shahin, whose name, again, whose real name we don't know, that the name that he chose, Shahin, means the majestic bird, or the falcon, or the royal falcon. Evidently, he chose that name because he was aware of his own importance and in his own position within the various Jewish communities and those who valued and appreciated works of literature. The fact that the earliest works of Iranian Jews had to do directly with the books of the Bible is evident in the writings of Shahin as well. Shahin is known basically for his major work, which is called Shahin's Commentary on the Torah. But it is not a commentary in prose. It's a commentary, interpretation, translation, and expansion of the texts of the Bible. His first major work within the larger body of the work that is called Shahin's Commentary or Interpretation on the Bible is called the Book of Moses, or in Persian, Musa Name. Name in Persian means book. Actually, it's related to the Indo-European word name, nam, which books were written basically on the names of kings, princes, and so on. Therefore, the classical name for books in Persian is Name, as, for example, in the famous book of the Iranian poet Shahnameh, the Book of the Kings, by the 11th century poet Ferdowsi, to which I will refer. Shahin started his commentary on the books on the first portion of the Bible, which is the Torah, and of course it contains 5 books. It is Genesis, or I've studied in Hebrew, Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Dvarim. Shahin started with the book of Exodus, and he expanded his commentaries and completed the 4 books of Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Numbers. The crux, or the major part of these 4 books that Shahin wrote have to do with the stories, the narratives that are told mostly in the book of Exodus, and later with the stories that we find in the other 4 books. The structure of the book, of Shahin's book, is very similar to the structure of books of poetry among the Muslim counterparts, which is it usually contains an introduction. The introduction is divided usually into 3 or 4 parts. It starts with the name of God, praise of God. Second, it goes with the praise of the Prophet, which is in this case, in the case of the Muslims, it is Muhammad. In the case of the Jews, it is Moses. The third one is usually a dedication to someone for whom the book was written. And the last part usually is a book, an explanation about the reason why the poet wrote the book. All these portions appear also in Shahin's commentary on what is called Sharh Shahin Torah, or Shahin's commentary on the Torah, which I said it starts in the book of Exodus and ends with Numbers. He finished the book in the year 1333, which is like the first half of the 14th century. A few years after he finished his book, his book on or commentary on the book, on the 4 books of the Torah or the law, he went back to the book of Genesis, which is called Bereshit Nameh, the book of Bereshit, or the book of Genesis. Again, in terms of the structure of the book and in terms of the literary elements that are involved, for example, rhyme and meter and the structure of the different couplets, it is very similar to Sharh Shahin Shura, the Torah, which is very similar, I said, to the 4 books of the Bible. Except here, as if he wanted to complete the commentary of entire 5 books of the Torah, he went back to the book of Genesis, and in the book of Genesis, he tells particularly the stories of Abraham and who was the founder of Jewish faith, his migration to the land of Israel, and later, of course, from Abraham to his son Isaac, and to Jacob, and the 10 tribes. Now, what we have to know is that Shahin and also the other Judo-Persian poets that came after him, whenever they write a commentary or a poetic commentary on the books of the Bible, it's not just a paraphrase, but it is an expansion of the biblical text and of the biblical stories, in which they include lots of sources from Jewish writings, including what one of the major sources of Jewish writings are, we call them the Midrash and Agadah. Midrash is homilies or commentaries that tell a story, but they usually have kind of a didactic point of view, and they want to teach the readers something, a point of wisdom, philosophy, and so on. In the book of Genesis, what we see, I said, it's a combination of poetry, which is very much the imagination and the ability of the poet to use different images and different imagery and different techniques in order to bring forth the different stories and different texts that are in the Bible, in this case in the book of Genesis. The success of Shahin in his work has to do very much, not only because he was the first poet, but because his wide range of familiarity with both the Jewish sources, biblical sources, Jewish commentaries. This is one group. And the other group, it was his familiarity with Persian, with works of poetry and works of interpretation and teachings of Islamic authorities that he used, and he combined them in interpreting and expanding the text of the Genesis. We see this both in the book of Genesis and, as I said, the first books, the other 4 books of the Torah on which he commented. As I said, Shaheen is known mostly due to his work and because of his commentary on the Bible, but on top of the first 5 books of the Torah, he also wrote a very, very large composition, also poetry, which is called the Book of Ardashir, or in Persian, Ardashir Name. According to Shaheen's understanding, Ardashir was in fact identical with Ahasuerus of the book of Esther that we are familiar, and we read it, of course, during Purim. This is Ardashir Name is mostly based on the narrative of the book of Esther, but Shaheen brings in lots of imaginative innovations. One of his major innovations in this book, in Ardashir Name, is that Ardashir, which is identical with Ahasuerus in the book of Esther, married Esther, or Queen Esther of the Esther scroll, and that from their marriage, Cyrus the Great was born. So, importance of Ardashir Name, in addition to a large body of stories and plots that he includes in his book, is that according to the understanding and imaginative or creative force of Shaheen, Cyrus the Great was the redeemer of the Jewish people. Cyrus, or Koresh, who appears in the books of the Bible as the Messiah or the redeemer of the Jewish people from the exile, is in fact the son of Esther from her marriage with King Ahasuerus. From here, I would like now to go a little further. There is a lot to say about, of course, about the characteristics of Shaheen's work, his use of language, his use of imagery, the degree that he was familiar with Islamic sources, the degree to which he was familiar with Iranian poets, and that he took from them or he was influenced by them. Whatever we say about Shaheen applies to a large degree also to the poets that came after him. As I said earlier, the Iranian Jews, the Iranian poets and writers, used the Persian language, using the Hebrew alphabet, including numerous Hebrew expressions and words and ideas, and they use all those materials in order to create new works. The second poet that came after Shahin, and it in many ways it continued the literary activity of Shahin, came about 80 or 90 years after Shahin. His name is Imrani, which evidently means someone who belongs to the family of Imran, which is the Arabic name for Amram, Moshe ben Amram, Moses son of Amram. Amram was Imran is the son, Imran is the father in Islamic sources, and also of course in Hebrew sources, the father as Moses. This poet, whose name is Imrani, evidently adopted the name. We don't know exactly what his full name was, but whereas about Shahin, we don't have much biographical information about this poet, fortunately, because of the information and details that he tells us in his many, many works. We know more about him and about the time in which he worked. And he tells us lots of actually information also about the community in which he was born and in which he grew up. Imrani was born in the middle of the 15th century, more accurately, in the first half of the 15th century, in the city of Isfahan, where a large community lived. And when he was evidently in his late 20s, he moved to the city of Kashan, to the north, in which also there was a large Jewish community, and there were lots of, according to what we know from other sources, Kashan was one of the important cultural centers of the Iranian Jews from 15th, 16th century all the way to the 18th, 19th century. Imrani saw himself in many ways as a disciple of Shahin, and he continued the work of Shahin where Shahin had stopped. As we saw, Shahin commented on the first books of the Torah, and he stopped there. Although he also commented on what we say Book of Esther and Book of Ezra, he didn't continue to comment and to write interpretation and commentary on the books that come immediately after the first 5 books of the Torah. What Imrani said, he took upon himself to continue the work of Shahin. So he started with the book of Joshua, which is the next book that comes after the book of the first 5 books of the Torah. Joshua, of course, the book of Joshua tells us about the story of the settlement of the Jewish tribes after they were released from Egypt and they settled in the land of Israel.